Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our lesson on visual effects and our discussion of how visual effects can be used to contribute to the meaning of a film. Now, film by its nature is what we call a composited medium. So, film combines already several different elements that contribute to its meaning. Those elements, as we have discussed so far this semester, would be production design, cinematography, film structure, acting, editing, and sound. And all of these elements are composited to create a final film which evokes specific meaning effects in an audience. Now, as we already discussed a little earlier in the semester, now digital production design can be used to actually create environments that never existed before. So the example we used in class was the example of the film Life of Pi, when the film was actually shot in a studio tank and basically in an indoor swimming pool, with an actor simply giving his performance in a boat, and then after the images of the actor giving his performance in the boat were captured, a digital background was added to make it look as if the actor was actually stranded in the middle of I believe it was the Pacific Ocean, and to also make it look like the actor was accompanied by a tiger. The actor was not in the the Pacific Ocean. The actor was in a boat in a swimming pool in a studio, and the tiger was never there at all. So the actor had to act as if he was interacting with a tiger. Well, these sort of visual effects have actually always been present in cinema, pretty much right from the beginning of cinema. From the beginning of cinema, people have been compositing images to create new images that never existed before. So people have been taking elements from one image, elements from another, elements from a third, and putting them together to create images that never existed independently before in order to give film specific meaning. So visual effects are used as storytelling tools. We don't just find them in science fiction films or fantasy films. We also find them used in realistic dramas. We also find them used in comedies. So here's an example of one of my favorite visual composited images from a comedy film, actually. This is from a film called Strange Brew, which was released in 1983, and it was a film which was basically about a pair of Canadian comics called the Mackenzie Brothers in the early 1980s. Two characters from Second City TV called the Mackenzie Brothers became very popular, and it was decided that they had their own movie. And there's a very important establishing shot at the beginning of the movie as the Mackenzie brothers are driving up to a sinister brewery. So they're driving up this cliffside, and they see on the left top of the cliff the Elsinore Brewery itself, and on the right top of the cliff the Royal Canadian Institute for the Mentally Insane. Now, in the center top of the cliff, there's the brewery. In the right top of the cliff, there's the Royal Canadian Institute for the Mentally Insane. And on the left top of the cliff, there is the Elsinore Castle, where the Elsinore family lives. Do you notice anything peculiar about this image? Well, here's what's peculiar about this image. This foreground that you see is Bluffers Park in Scarborough. The left top image that you see is Casa Loma, which is right in the heart of downtown Toronto. The Elsinore Brewery that you see is actually the Molson Brewery, which is just off the 401 near Toronto Airport. And the Royal Canadian Institute for the Mentally Insane is actually the East Toronto Water Station, which is by Woodbine Beach. None of these buildings are within 6 miles of each other or within 6 miles of Bluffers Park. So this is an entirely composited image. You have the foreground, Bluffers Park in Scarborough. You have Casa Loma to the top left, the Molson plant in the top middle, and the East York Water Station on the top right. So this is pre-digital composing of images. So we're going to talk about how people establish these kind of visual effects prior to the existence of visual technology. And I just use this as an example that visual effects have always existed in film, and they're not just confined to fantasy films or to science fiction films. Strange Brew is a comedy, quite a funny one at that. All right. The person who we really refer to as the father of visual effects was a Frenchman by the name of Georges Méliès. Now, Méliès, if you saw Martin Scorsese's film Hugo, which was released by a few years back, Méliès is played in the film by Ben Kingsley as a much older man, after the point in his career when he was active in making movies. Méliès was a stage magician, I should say. So he made his living doing tricks that a stage magician would. And then, in the late 1890s, photography started to become a popular medium, so Méliès decided to experiment with photography as well. Now, as we discussed in our lesson on film history, early films were very, very short. They were usually only a couple of minutes long. And because the novelty itself of having moving images available was so interesting and appealing to people at the time, early films really didn't tell stories very often. So people would pay 5 cents to go to a movie and see a train arriving at a station. And just the fact that motion could be captured on film and then projected to an audience, that itself was enough of a novelty that the audience would come. So Méliès decides to try and get into filmmaking, see if he can make some money that way. One day, his camera jams while he's just filming people walking down a street. So he repairs the jam, captures some more footage, gets the film developed, plays the film back, and realizes that at the point where the camera jammed, the effect that you see on the final film is, wow, a whole bunch of people disappeared, and another bunch of people suddenly reappeared. And Méliès realized just by stopping the camera and having somebody who was previously in front of it walk away, you could create effects where people convincingly disappear from the screen, or you could do the reverse. Film an empty street, then stop the camera, have people walk on the street in position, start the camera again, and the final effect is that people materialize out of nowhere. So, as a magician and thinking like a magician, Méliès realizes that film can be used to create these kind of illusions of materializing and dematerializing that magicians create on stage. Méliès also had an interesting accident happen. He was capturing some footage, didn't realize it, but he'd actually rewound some film through the camera and exposed the film twice. And when he developed the film, it looked as if there were transparent ghosts walking around all over the screen. And Méliès quickly realized that if you record images onto film twice, you can actually give people the appearance of being people or objects the appearance of being transparent and seeing through simply by recording two different images on film. So Méliès decides to go into the film business for himself. So as a magician, he's very familiar with the stage. So he builds himself a small film studio. The studio actually has glass ceilings, and the building can be physically rotated so that the sun is always striking the building at an optimum angle. And he makes dozens of short films featuring these new special effects that he's discovered. So let's just take a look at a couple of examples. So, as I mentioned in class, Silent films were often tinted and hand-colored, so this is a still from this is a clip from Méliès's famous film, A Trip to the Moon. Now, what the film involves is explorers have actually managed to land on the moon, and they are now being menaced by a new mean creature. So here, you can see this group of explorers on the left of the frame, and this very sinister moon creature is menacing them on the right of the frame. So, one of these professors is going to strike the moon creature with this umbrella, who will explode and disappear. Here comes the creature. Bang, he's gone. And a big flash of smoke appears. Well, what happened was Méliès simply, at the point where the actor with the umbrella strikes the umbrella down, stopped the camera, asked all of the other actors to remain perfectly in position, had the actor playing the evil moon creature walk off the screen, started the camera again, and at the instant where the camera was started, ignited a burst of flash powder on screen so that the image you get appears to be a creature disappearing in a puff of smoke. So let's have just another quick look at that. So here again, we're at the point where the explorers are being menaced by this moon creature who's about to walk on the screen. Here they are, they're terrified. Here comes this very scary creature off from the right of the screen. He's coming forward, he's menacing them, they're terrified. Now, the professor lifts his umbrella. Bang, strikes the moon creature who has appeared to disappear in a puff of smoke. And the same will happen with this next moon creature. Again, bang, and you can actually see a slight jump on the screen as the actors move. So watch the actors again. Now, the second effect I referred to, an effect created by superimposition, is used, of course, to make it look as if something is ghostly and transparent or is gradually materializing out of nowhere. So here is an instance from A Trip to the Moon where Méliès uses superimposition, just stopping the camera, backing it up a bit, and then capturing a new image on top of the image that's already there to achieve an effect. So here, the moon explorers are quite tired. They're going to sleep for the evening. They're putting down their blankets on the surface of the moon. And you're about to see, first, a comet appears to go by them over the screen. And then the stars, you'll notice how you have semi-transparent stars materializing in the sky above them as they go to sleep. And again, the stars have faces. This effect is created by superimposition, and now you have the planets and the asteroids coming into place. And you'll notice that just down here in the left corner, you can see that the asteroids are transparent. You can see through them. So this is an effect created by superimposition. Now they fade out, and yes, it is snowing on the surface of the moon in this film. So, from effects created by simply stopping the camera and starting it again and making things appear to suddenly materialize or dematerialize out of thin air, and from effects that could be used to make it look like something is ghost-like and transparent is coming across the screen, this effect of superimposition, Méliès soon realizes that you can also create interesting effects by blocking off certain areas of the camera, simply just not allowing light to get into the camera through certain sections, capturing some images, rewinding the film in the camera again, opening up the sections of the lens that you had blocked off, but closing down the sections where you had previously allowed images to be captured, and you could create very interesting effect in this way. So this technique that Méliès began to use is a technique called the use of in-camera mats. So basically, what would happen was that a mat box would be placed in front of the camera, an element like this, and then Méliès would film an actor performing an action, as you can see here, usually in front of some kind of a black background. So what the camera would see, what the camera would capture, is the actor in the foreground doing what the actor in the whatever action the actor in the foreground was doing, and using whatever props that the actor in the foreground was using. But because the background was black, the camera would record no light. A mask would then be created of the area where the actor had been performing. You can see this mask that's been created here. So basically, what you've captured on the first pass is what I'm highlighting now, actor performing in front of a black background. Well, a mat would be created of the area where the actor was performing, and this mat would block off any light going into the camera in that particular area of the frame, and this mat would be mounted on an object like this, which I'm highlighting on the left, a mat box. So it would be placed physically in front of the lens of the camera, blocking light from entering that area of the lens. The film would be rewound through the camera, and a background plate or background action or other images would be captured. Then the film would be developed, and the final film would show all of these elements together. Actor in the foreground with the action photographed in the background. So this is the process that Méliès used, which is called the use of in-camera mats. So let's look at a short film where Méliès uses these in-camera mats to create some interesting effects. So here's a short film that Méliès made in 1898 called Un homme de tête. So you have a gentleman so he's just pulled his head off, put it on a table, and his head is rematerialized. Pulled his head off, put it on a table, a second head is materialized. Pulled his head off, put it on a table. Now he's going to play himself a little bit of banjo music, and all of his heads are singing together. Oh, he made them vanish. All right, so let's have another look at this clip of film. So, one of the things you're going to notice is that you're going to see some distortion just around the two tabletops. So look at the tabletop here. Notice how it seems to be jumping around a little bit. So, again, that's created by passing the camera, passing the film through the camera twice, more than one time. So he's actually used multiple passes to do this, and this is why the top of the table seems to be warbling and fluttering around a bit entirely through this effect. So here, firstly, he pulls his head off. Now, this head that he's carrying in his hand is actually a fake rubber head that he's made, and so for the instances where he seems to pull his head off and then place it on the table, what he's done is he's used one of these effects where, at the instant where he grabs his head like this, he stops the camera, they put a black bag over his head, so again the camera won't capture any light, and then they place in his hands at the same position this model, this fake model of his head, so that the final shot looks like he's grabbed his own head and pulled it off of his shoulders. So if you look very carefully here, you can actually see the outlines of the black bag as he places his head on the table. Now, again, through the process of running the film through the camera twice, they're now using they've been using a mat to block off this area through the initial passes. Now, running the camera running the film through the camera twice again, they've used mats to block off the table so that now all that will be captured are these heads talking on the table as they're gradually placed down. So same thing again. And here, all they've simply done here you'll notice he's headless. You can just roughly see the outlines of the paper bag, of the black bag. They stop the camera, pull the bag off his head, and suddenly his head is miraculously reappeared. And again, look at the way in which the tabletops are slightly imperfect and transparent. So, he appears to wave through because they've used now a mat to block off this area as they're capturing the footage of the heads talking on top of the tabletops. And again, same action here. So, I'm just going to draw your attention again to these little imperfections around the tabletops, and the fact that when all of the heads are on the table singing, they're actually slightly transparent. See how you can see through them a bit? So, it's a little hard to be exact and exactly precise when you're using in-camera mats and rerunning the film through the camera several times. You will get slight imperfections in the image. Mind you, this is pretty impressive for something that was done 121 years ago. So, gradually, a more exact process that would produce images with far fewer flaws was developed. That process was the use of what are called traveling mats rather than in-camera mats. Now, the way that traveling mats work is that it will be decided that two images want to be composited. So here we have this image that has been composited, which I talked about earlier, and this image was composited through the use of traveling mats. So just to make this simple, let's just talk about how this image was created of let's say the brewery on top of Bluffers Park. So we have the brewery with a stormy background on top of the park. So how did they create this? Well, they used traveling mats. So what they wanted, firstly, the main object of this image would have been the brewery. So they would have captured an image of the brewery. So here, with this circle, I'm capturing this main image of the brewery. Then they would have decided they wanted this foreground of Bluffers Park. So they would have then taken a photograph of the foreground, they would have taken footage of the foreground of the environment in Bluffers Park. So they would have gone out to the airport, captured some footage of the brewery here, then gone to Scarborough, captured some footage of Bluffers Park here. So we now have two main images, one of the brewery, one of Bluffers Park. From the image of the brewery, they would have created two mats using high contrast film. So these mats are actually other pieces of film that can also be run through a projector. They would have created what's called a female mat, where everything in the image is blacked out except for the area where the brewery appears, which is completely blank. So light is completely blocked from passing through the camera in areas where the brewery doesn't appear, but since the image is transparent, in areas where the brewery does appear, you have light allowed to pass through. Both of these images are then passed through a duplicator, and you wind up with an image of only the brewery captured on film sitting in a completely white space. The same thing is done with the environment. So here you have that original footage of Bluffers Park, but that footage of Bluffers Park is combined through a duplicator with a male mat. The male mat has only the area where the brewery sits blacked out, and everything else is allowed to pass through the camera. So here then, what you wind up with is an image of Bluffers Park with the area where the brewery will finally appear. That'll be completely transparent. Then these two images are also, these two resulting images, one, the image of the brewery surrounded by complete transparent white space. Secondly, the image of Bluffers Park with the area where the brewery is supposed to appear, blocked out by complete white space. Those are passed through the optical printer, and the final print that you wind up with is an image of the brewery sitting in Bluffers Park. And these mats, these areas where a portion of the screen is either completely blacked out or completely transparent to allow light to come through, these are called traveling mats. So with the traveling mats, because you're allowing only the image of the main image that you want and only the image of the environment that you want to pass through the camera, and they're only passing through the camera once to result in a final image at this point, you don't wind up with these imperfections and overlays. So the final image that you get is much more seamless. Now, other techniques, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about production design, that are used are glass paintings, hanging foreground miniatures, and the Schuften process using mirrors. The Schuften process is also called aerial image. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a clip of Charlie Chaplin doing something that appears to be, I should say, very, very dangerous. By the way, Modern Times is my favorite of Chaplin's silent films. Everybody else seems to prefer a film that he did called City Lights, but for some reason I simply find Modern Times to be the better of the two films, although I would say they're both great movies. So let's have a look at this famous roller skating scene from Modern Times. So Charlie is employed as an evening security guard at a department store, and he's taking his friend through the department store with him. They're in the toy department, and he finds himself some roller skates, decides to put them on. Now he's skating around. Whoa, he's skating right to the edge of a very dangerous precipice. He doesn't realize it's behind him because he's looking the other way. And now he's saying, I can do this blindfolded. So he is skating around the edge of a dangerous precipice, completely blindfolded. He doesn't know it's there. And at this point, he's one of the bigger stars in the world, so this is a great risk. And she is absolutely horrified when she realizes what he's up to. Wow, he's getting very close there. This is very, very scary, isn't it? And why would the studio allow one of their biggest stars to actually take such an incredible risk? It looks like he could fall down several floors. Oh, and now he realizes the danger that he's facing, and he's very scared by this, and she pulls him away to safety. So here's some production video which shows you how they accomplished that. And no, they actually did not let the biggest actor in the world skate near a dangerous precipice. So, again, see how it appears that he's skating right near the edge of this? Whoop! Guess what? That dangerous precipice is actually a painting that's been hung in front of the camera so that in the final image, look how this lines up. What the camera sees is Charlie skating in front of a dangerous background. Let's have a second look at that. So this is called a hanging foreground miniature. And again, you have either a miniature set or a painting hung just in front of the camera. And the painting, you'll notice, is composed with depth and perspective so that it appears to be three-dimensional, and so what the camera sees is that he is skating in front of this very dangerous three-dimensional background. But here, as you can see now, the camera is placed here. This very dangerous drop is actually a painting, a foreground miniature that's been placed on a blackboard in front of the camera so that the image that the camera records is of this very dangerous drop. He is actually not in any real danger at all. And again, we see as we come forward again, when it lines up though, what the camera sees is him in front of this very dangerous precipice, and that is the image that gets recorded. So that is why it convincingly looked like he was in a great degree of danger when he performed this particular action. Now, other techniques that visual effects artists have traditionally used to create effects are, firstly, glass paintings. We discussed glass paintings in production design. So again, using a technique in painting called trompe-l'œil, artists are able to create paintings on glass which look convincingly like real backgrounds, and then actors are composited into those backgrounds to appear as if they're performing on them. Now, the use of miniatures and the use of mirrors to create images with miniatures is referred to formally as the Schuften process. Informally, it's referred to as a process called aerial image. And what this involves is usually creating a model of an environment or a set, placing that model at a 45-degree angle to the camera, and then placing placing the model at a 90-degree angle to the camera, then placing a mirror at a 45-degree angle to the camera. And in this case, they've used a gap in the mirror. So what they'll capture, even though this model is only about 18 inches high, and this guard, who's standing in front of the castle supposedly, is 5'11", once this is reflected into the mirror, and the camera captures this image with the guard position, so he'll appear through a gap in the mirror, you'll have a convincing image of an actor actually standing in the gateway to a castle, even though the castle is actually a miniature. So here, just as an example of the Schuften effect, what has happened is that, in this case, to give an example of the Schuften process, also called aerial image, what the maker of this short film has done is taken a still from a famous early screen version of Dracula, is mounting that still image at a 90-degree angle to the camera, and has a mirror at a 45-degree angle to the camera. An error of that mirror is scraped out, allowing light to pass through, so it looks like there's actually action happening in the background of one of these archways that are in Dracula's castle. So, watch this archway. And now we have a person appearing to walk into the photograph, look around, puts their hands up, wondering what's going on, and then walking off screen. And leaving. So that effect was again achieved by placing that photograph at a 45-degree angle, placing the photograph at a 90-degree angle to the camera, placing a mirror at a 45-degree angle to the camera to reflect the image of the photograph into the camera lens, then having a gap, a scraped out area in the mirror which would allow light to pass through, and then photographing something in the background through that area that allowed light to pass through. So again, let's just see that quickly one more time. Here's this person in the background, walks around, takes a look. Decides to leave. So here we're just going to see a little bit of footage related to the production of Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back, and the use of those glass paintings, those matte paintings, in combination with images captured through photography to create specific visual effects.
Doing matte painting is so exciting because if you can accomplish it well, there's a great deal of satisfaction. So there are real stormtroopers on the set, and then the rest were added by the matte artist.
So, now see as they escape into this background. So, all of this in the background is a matte painting, as a glass painting that has been composited with the image that's being shot on film. What you see here, this blank area, this is where the actual action that has been captured by the cinematographers will be added into the frame, but the entire background is actually a painting.
Sky of the lighting. Elegance is what it's all about.
You can see them here working on the painting. And it looks like a convincing background. Here's another example.
Just a wonderful example of all these stormtroopers, and nobody knows that it's a matte painting. You just assume that this is a very large set.
So again, matte paintings were used to make very small sets look like very large sets.
Shields up. Keep your eyes open, huh?
So again, only this is filmed. All the rest of it is a painting.
You've got a lot of guts coming here after what you pulled.
All of these are paintings, and the main action of the film is just being inserted into the background of the painting after the fact.
It's useless to resist. Don't let yourself be destroyed is all you want in the end.
And again, the swamp at Dagobah is another painting. Also, very popular process during the Hollywood studio area was a process called rear screen projection. Now, what would happen in rear screen projection is that the actors would actually be performing in front of a movie screen, and the movie screen would have a film projected on it with images of a live environment, perhaps of a street with cars whizzing by, and what the camera would then see would be a foreground and a background, and record them as a consistent image. So here's an example of some filmmakers in a comic film called Airplane having a little fun with rear screen projection. So we have here an establishing shot of a car driving down a road late at night.
Now we can't.
And so what has happened is a small set has been built of the front of a car. The two actors are positioned in this small set of the front part of a car, and they're actually in front of a movie screen onto which an image is being projected. And during the classical Hollywood period, this is how scenes which involved people driving in cars or with motion in the background were captured.
Do that. The risk of a flameout's too
So you'll
great.
see the road seems to be
Keep it
passing by
24,000.
him.
No, feet. One of the passengers is going to land that plane.
Is that possible?
Possible. It's 101 shot.
Now the filmmakers decide to have some fun with this.
I know this guy.
You do? Who is it?
His name's Ted Stryker. I flew with him during the war. It won't make my job any easier tonight. Ted Stryker was a crack flight leader up to a point. One of those men who, let's just say, felt too much inside. Maybe another kind. And all the pieces on a particular mission. Just hope that doesn't happen enough.
As I mentioned before, in Charlie Chaplin's film Monsieur Verdoux, he was actually using rear screen projection to create convincing images that the action of the film was taking place in Paris, France, when in fact the film was actually made in his own studio in Hollywood, California. But Chaplin was able to simply use filmed footage of people walking around on a street in Paris, project that footage into a screen in the background of his images, and then act with his partner in the foreground, and this would create an acceptable and realistic image of two people talking on a busy street in Paris. Now, another technique that began, one of the limitations of using both in-camera mats, traveling mats, and hanging foreground miniatures and glass paintings is that the image needs to be static. There's no room for camera movement because to use in-camera and traveling mats, everything needs to be in exactly the same position in order for all of the images to line up correctly. Because, especially in the case of traveling mats, the images need, firstly, the male and female mats, and then the matted images need to be processed through an optical printer, a device called a duplicator, in order for everything in the final mat to match up. However, starting in the late 1980s and moving through into the 1990s, filmmakers such as James Cameron and Robert Zemeckis, whose film Death Becomes Her is going to be seen in this course, start to use a process called motion control in which they can create not only matted compositive images, but also add camera movements to those images in order to make the final images look a little less static, a little more cinematic, and have a little more movement within them. So here we're going to have a look at some motion control effects from Robert Zemeckis' film Back to the Future 2, and this was made about 2 years prior to Death Becomes Her.
Happy Back to the Future Day, indie filmmakers! Today is the day at 4:29 p.m. that Marty McFly arrives in the future. I am such a big fan of this film that Amy included it in our wedding vows.
Watch Back to the Future 2 with you whenever you want.
But before hoverboards, Pepsi Perfect, and maybe a Cubs World Championship came to fruition, this 1989 film perfected a very cool filmmaking technique. To let Michael J. Fox play 3 characters in one scene, traditionally you'd lock down the shot on a tripod to stitch the takes together. But Industrial Light and Magic developed VistaGlide, a portable motion control dolly that enabled more cinematic, repeatable movement. It's a technique I've always wanted to try, so let's test it out on my Cinetics Axis 360. Wow, this is pretty cool. Do you use this for a lot of motion control work? No, I usually just use this thing for time lapses. Anytime I do an effects shot, I often just lock it down on a tripod, split the frame, and then add a little bit of camera shake to hide the fact that I'm using a tripod. But this looks more cinematic. Definitely. Thanks for watching.
So how that effect is achieved, you'll notice that this tripod that he's referring to is that his camera is locked down on this tripod, and this tripod has a rod in which the camera can be allowed to travel with a very specific motion. It will glide up and down this rod.
A Cinetics Axis 360.
See the camera gliding up? So basically what he did to achieve those shots is, because the camera can be programmed to create exactly the same motion in multiple times, he first performed the dialogue for the right side of the screen with the camera traveling down that pre-programmed track, and then did the take for the right side of the screen, again with the camera using exactly the same motion, composited the images together so that they would duplicate the motion according to the same pattern, and this now allows filmmakers to use matte shots and composited shots and not simply be restricted to having a camera locked down in one position, but rather to be able to have several camera movements happening within a composited shot. So here,
this 1989 film perfected
here we have
cool
a zoom out
technique.
with the same actors speaking to each other, a pan across with the same actor speaking 3 times.
But Industrial Light and Magic developed VistaGlide,
and again, same actor with the camera moving forward.
That enabled more cinematic, repeatable movement.
Now, in case you're wondering how all of these images are matted together, how all of these male mats, female mats, and original images are composited into one image, and how this was done prior to the era of digital technology, basically what was used was a device called an optical printer. So the optical printer would actually be a device where you could project several different one or several different reels of film onto another reel of film to duplicate images. So in this case, what would happen was, as we discussed, in the example of the foreground of Bluffers Park and the main image of the Molson Brewery. The footage that had been captured of the Molson Brewery would be projected into an optical printer, and a female mat would be created, which would allow light to only pass through the frame in the area located by the where the brewery is located. A second mat, a male mat, would be created, which would not allow light to pass through the area where the brewery was located, but would allow light to pass through every additional area of the frame. The main image and would be passed through the image of a female mat onto a third piece of film to now create an image where you had only the brewery appearing in the frame and everything else would be transparent. The background of Bluffers Park would be passed through a male mat, which would not allow light to pass through the frame where the brewery would be located, but would allow light to pass through the frame everywhere else. And what you wind up with is an image of the Bluffers Park with the area where the brewery is sitting now itself transparent. Then the image of the brewery with the entire background transparent, and the image of the background with the area where the brewery is transparent are passed through this optical printer. You wind up with a final piece of film which has the brewery sitting in the middle of sitting in the middle of Bluffers Park. So the device that these reels of film are mounted on and new reels of film are created is called an optical printer. Now, the most popular optical printer of the classical Hollywood period was an optical printer called the Dupy Duplicator. So here you can see you have this machine on which several reels of film can be mounted. Those reels of film are then projected through each other. So you have one projector projecting an image through another projector, and then finally projecting that into a camera so you can combine several reels of film and now create a new film image. Now, Star Wars was one of the first films, firstly, to revise the tradition of matte painting. People hadn't been doing matte paintings for a long time. In 1977 when Star Wars was released. But what Star Wars also was one of the first films to use was computerized motion control. So a few moments ago, when we were talking about motion control, the process for motion control on that tripod that the person was demonstrating was mechanical. The camera is riding physically up and down a rail, and the rate at which it goes physically up and down the rail is mechanically controlled. Star Wars embodied computerized motion control, so very, very specific and subtle and complicated camera movements could be now programmed using a computer, and the camera would now duplicate exactly very, very subtle and very, very complicated movements, and could do them exactly, could repeat them exactly for many, many different passes, which allowed the compositing of many, many more different elements. It allowed the creating of more mats, the creation of more mats, which allowed the creation of final images with many more elements composited into them. Nowadays, all of this is now done digitally. So, as we've discussed, whereas prior, visual effects were added in the studio backlot, often using rear screen projection and motion control after primary photography had been completed. Nowadays, special effects are often done digitally. So as we saw earlier in the semester, most of Life of Pi is filmed in an indoor studio tank, an indoor swimming pool, and all of the backgrounds and the tigers are added, and the tiger are added after the fact. So this is still the same effect as matte painting. You're filming in a very small studio, and then adding in a background later on, but you're doing so now digitally instead of doing so with actual paints and glass. Camera mapping then becomes even more important than it ever has before, because in order to create convincing digital images, the camera needs to duplicate exactly the previous motions that it had before. Why? Because now the camera needs to make many different passes at an environment. The camera is no longer locked down, so it needs to move through an environment several times and duplicate exactly the same motions that it took before, in order that more elements can be added into and rendered into a final image. Now, one thing that's become very popular in the within the past few years are 3D movies. There was initially 3D became a very popular effect in the 1950s, but the problem was that it was often used as a gimmick. So a lot of very bad 3D movies were made in the late 1950s and early 1960s, which almost always involved scenes where something would be thrown toward the camera. The audience would have the effect that something would be thrown over their heads and would duck. And this was, so firstly, after a while, it was considered to be very cheesy and gimmicky. Excuses were always found just to throw things at the audience whenever a 3D film was being made. Secondly, and more importantly, unfortunately, I can only think of one 3D movie made in the 50s that is actually good. That movie was House of Wax, and it's actually a really neat, really freaky horror film. Most of the other 3D movies are just cheesy and gimmicky, and the screenplay just exists as an excuse to have things thrown at you. So, for a period of over 30 years, 3D was actually considered to be just sort of an obsolete technology, a gimmick that people had become tired of. So nobody was making 3D movies. And as we know, about 15 years ago, 3D movies started to make a really, really big comeback. So, how do 3D movies work? What is the process? Well, basically, the way that the human brain works is that your eyes, you calculate distance based on the angle of your eyeballs relative to an object that you're looking at. So if I'm focused on something that is quite close to me, my eyeballs will tend to converge with one another, and my brain will automatically calculate what the rough distance is between myself and the object that I'm looking at based on the angles of my eyeballs to each other. If I'm looking at something further away, that angle will widen, and my brain will again automatically judge the distance based on that angle. So, things that we perceive as being further away from us, our eyeballs widen. Our eyeballs are described as being in positive parallax. Parallax means things are running parallel to each other, so they're either parallel or widening outwards. Negative parallax is when our eyeballs are moving towards each other and we get an angle towards each other. So when our eyeballs are moving towards each other, our brain thinks something that they're looking at is closer. When our eyeballs are moving away from each other, our brain thinks something is further away. So, what will happen is when a film is being converted into 3D, a technician called a stereographer will come up with a depth score for the film, and just like a movie score, or just like the sound designer, will decide where each object on the screen should be perceived in terms of its relative distance from the viewer. Should the viewer perceive this object as being close up, this object as being in the middle ground, this object as being in the background? Should an object be moving gradually towards us? And the stereographer will basically place cues in the print of the film, which, when they're combined with the 3D glasses that we put on, actually trick our eyes into moving together or apart, not in the ways that they would normally move together or apart. So what will happen is that at 0 parallax, our eyes are perceiving an object as it normally would. Here are our eyes. Here is the film screen. This is where we would normally perceive roughly everything happening up on the screen, about 63 meters away from us. What the stereographer does is for certain elements on the screen, will trick our eyes into a position of negative parallax. So although this object is actually sitting up there on the screen, our eyeballs shift together, and our brain tells us this object is not way back at the screen, it's actually much closer. They can also trick our eyes into a state of positive parallax. Although this image, again, is sitting right up there on the screen 63 meters away, those cues can be built in that our eyeballs move apart, and our brain tells us, oh, this object is 100 meters away, much farther back from the screen. So that is basically how 3D effects work. Robert Zemeckis has also been one of the filmmakers who consistently has used 3D not just as a gimmick, but as a means of enhancing storytelling in his films. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed our lesson on visual effects. Please do let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.